Hello and welcome to Border Crossing, essential information and opportunities for international businesses with Chip Hobecker. These podcasts are designed to help you get a better understanding of some of the most important current issues and problems that affect businesses. Chip will examine the key points, help you to see the advantages and disadvantages, and provide you with any help sheets and support that you need. And just so you know, Chip heads up both the consulting division and the turnaround and restructuring practice for the firm Rehmann in the US. He has served as a court-appointed receiver, a chief restructuring officer, and as a fiduciary in international, federal and state proceedings in the US. He's also a board member for the National Association of Federal Equity Receivers, where he heads up the International Committee, and he's a fellow of Insol International. If you want to get in touch with Chip, he can be contacted via the Rehmann's website or on LinkedIn. We hope you enjoy this podcast. In this podcast, we discuss the investigative process of getting back personal or company assets that have been taken dishonestly, either as part of a fraud or through theft. We discuss how important it is to get an accurate and informative trail of the right information and how a tactical approach can be the key to reducing costs and speeding up the process of reclaiming those assets. We talked to Chuck Story, Director of Operations for Corporate Investigative Services at Rehmann. Chuck, it's really good to see you again. Are you as busy as you have been?
Good morning, and good to see you as well. It is still just as busy, but a little bit of breathing room, which I'm very thankful for.
That's good. That's good. Now, one of the things that you spend a lot of time working on is getting assets back for people. So why are you getting these assets back? Why have they lost them? Was it carelessness?
They certainly would argue it's not their carelessness. More often than not, it would be individuals' nefarious activities and deceit, unfortunately.
What kind of situations are you talking about here?
It could be a number of original situations, if you will, but ultimately it's typically an investment from a third party into a company or a loan of some sort to an individual or group of individuals to purchase companies. And then those monies that were either invested or lent are not used for what they were supposed to be used for, or just, quite frankly, in Chuck language, blown, or just spent for certain individuals' personal gains and not for the intended use.
Yes, we had a case like that here where 10 million disappeared from the local council on a football ground, and I still don't think they found it.
Oh,
so
wow.
It's that kind of thing, isn't it, where money just disappears into personal pockets. So what kind of clients do you normally work with then?
Our primary contact is more often than not the various attorneys and law firms that are representing maybe private equity groups, maybe individual investors, but we really work lockstep with law firms. That's the power, quite frankly, to leverage our expertise as well as with their expertise and access to legal service, subpoenas, etc.
Because it must be really hard to start digging into financial information these days. I mean, there's so many privacy laws and laws around banks and what they can give out. And, well, nobody can reveal anything anymore, can they? So, I mean, how on earth and where do you start with trying to track down financial information to find out where things have gone, or personal information to find out where items have gone?
Well, you pretty well nailed the first hurdle. There are a lot of rules, regulations, laws, et cetera, governing what personal information is accessible from third parties. So having said that, that is why, one, it is super important to work with the law firms that may have obtained a judgment against, we'll just call them nefarious individuals or groups that may have gone off with some money. And so then we can leverage legal process. But even before that, really deep diving and gaining an understanding of the subjects, if you will, of the judgments, how they live their life, where they live their life, what type of lifestyle they lived, and where they may have historically consumed or utilized money in their sort of normal everyday life, personal as well as professional, because ultimately habits are hard to break. That's sort of the beginning swipe. And then obviously a lot of details come out of that research and sort of a 10,000-foot view.
Yeah, I mean, I could easily be tracked down for my Starbucks habit. I mean, I think they just have to hang out around a few Starbucks.
You, as well as I suspect millions of other people.
They even take your name as well. It's not subtle. So.
Right. That's very true.
So what kind of information do you go after then? I mean, is it all sorts of types or is it purely financial? How do you start to pull this information together, and what is it you need?
Like I said, connecting with the attorneys leverages the ability to gain further information, but there's a lot of publicly available information out there about individuals and groups. And so that is leveraged to really develop a picture, if you will, of habits and lifestyles. And then ultimately someone's continued life, maybe after they had stolen or diverted or misused funds from, let's just say, client A, they likely did not go into a cave and stop living their life. They're still living their life somewhere, somehow, and using funds that are likely now deposited in a different financial institution. So if we're able to identify that sort of lifestyle and habit, then you can generally begin to identify where new funds are being consumed. And then from that point forward, you start tracking down where maybe some of those assets and funds are housed to fund, if you will, their new life.
Yeah, so their new house or their new motorbike or whatever it is they've decided to spend the money on, you can start to find where they're spending that money.
Ideally, that's exactly right. Ultimately, whether it is this topic with respect to tracking down assets and monies and funds, or investigating financial frauds or forensic matters or policies and procedures, ultimately it all boils down to creative problem solving. So there's a lot of dialogue that we have with our clients and prospects to understand truly what they are looking to solve and what questions they really are wanting answered. And so then, as long as we begin with a really open dialogue with the client, that lends itself to gaining a significant amount of intelligence about the client as well as the subject, if you will. That's a pretty strong word, but the individual or individuals we're looking into provides a lot of intelligence and intel about them. Once we collect that information, it begins to paint a picture and helps direct us to those potential habits, those lifestyle choices they may have made historically, and likely some of them are continuing to be made by those people. That makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But at the end of the day, you must have to get sort of some kind of financial evidence. You've got to have evidence of payments and money on paper or purchases on paper. And surely that must be very hard to get from either banks or other organizations. So how do you go about that? Because otherwise it's not going to stack up in the court, is it?
Correct. And that's where, quite frankly, legal process really is leveraged because, one, it provides a documented process through which we obtained the information. It's defendable in court. We didn't circumvent certain things and, quite frankly, obtain information illegally, because then that's evidence from bad fruit. It's fruit from the forbidden tree, if you will.
Yeah. So it's all got to be done legally. So sort of what criteria does a judge look for in the material you provide? Because I presume then they make the decision that you can go in and then claim those assets based on the information that you're giving.
Obviously, if there's a judgment in place, the plaintiff, if you will, already has the court on their side with respect to a judgment that's been levied against subject of the judgment. And then it's a matter of just identifying where those funds and assets are that are included in that judgment.
Okay, so then once you found it and you can prove that you found it, then you can actually seize.
Correct. And then you just document and basically build the case and reasoning as to why these assets or these funds will satisfy the court judgment.
Okay, so and as long as you've got that on paper, then you can go ahead and do it, or does it need to be re-signed off by the court, or what's that process?
Counsels will present that information to the court. But the big thing is identifying where those assets are.
Okay, so actually, if you haven't got the case right and haven't identified them properly, it won't be any good going to the court to get it signed off by counsel, because the information isn't there that they need to show that you've actually identified assets accurately.
Correct. None of this could be willy-nilly, despite what may be out there in thought and assumptions. You can't just go take money very easily from any institution, because guess what? They view themselves as potentially liable if they don't follow the rules of the law as well. So unless you're going to those institutions where funds or assets have been identified with proper legal process, with proper investigative process, they're not going to listen to you, because they ultimately are protecting themselves as well to not be held liable for turning over assets and funds that they should not have done.
Yeah, so really it is so dependent on being able to build a rock solid case that demonstrates the connections between money and the person and purchases. Or
absolutely. Ultimately, everyone's protecting themselves from further legal action as well. So you've got to tiptoe around the tulips at times, but there's still creative ways to leverage proper legal process to get to where a client or prospect needs to go, where we need to go as well.
Yeah, so it's a real combination of not just a bit of clever problem-solving thinking in terms of looking at the information that you have and then seeing the patterns in it, or seeing the avenues you can pursue to get the information, but also knowing the clever places to go for information. I mean, I wouldn't know where to start, but, you said there's loads available freely earlier on in this conversation. You said there's lots available. I wouldn't have a clue. So is that the skill, is sort of knowing where to go for this information that someone like me wouldn't have a clue about?
It really is, because there aren't too many manuals per se as to how to identify this information. It's really a thought process, years of experience of just observing, assessing, and working collaboratively, either working with prosecutors or law firms in the civil world to identify these nuggets of intelligence and information.
And I guess what that does ultimately is keep down the number of times you have to go to court, isn't it? Because that becomes very expensive, very time consuming. If you keep having to ask for subpoenas for information, if you can find that information in clever ways in different areas, it makes it faster, I presume.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, there's been many times where we've identified, I'll make up a number, let's just say potentially 30 subpoenas, but then we'll prioritize, okay, these entities which we are recommending to subpoena for particular points of information likely will have the biggest bang for your buck, per se. They'll have the biggest treasure trove potentially of information. So how about you focus on these 7, if you will, and then let's start with the 7 and see where we go from there.
So actually, it makes life a lot easier for not only the people that are trying to get their assets back, but also for the lawyers as well, in terms of dealing with the court and moving things on as quickly as possible.
Oh, for sure. You don't always, at times you have to use sort of a shotgun approach, but ideally you're not going to do that too often, because it oftentimes wastes time and money. So we try to avoid that at all costs and be as efficient as possible, ultimately with finite and specific decision making.
Yeah, it's being tactical, isn't it?
Very much so. You've got to start broad, but you really should come down to a tactical level as quickly as possible to ideally be as efficient as possible.
Yeah. So what sort of outcomes do you get for the people that employ you to do this for them? Obviously, you work for receivers, sometimes when to help them track people down. And I presume all other sort of legal cases where there's been fraud, etc. So what sort of outcomes do you get for them?
Ultimately, we've identified numerous assets from vehicles, properties. We also involve our background group that helps tremendously with this. Literally vessels, but then also ideally you're identifying bank accounts where there are funds deposited, which are subject to the court judgment. So from there, it literally can explode to a number of other accounts. And so then again, legal process, but millions of dollars. Ultimately, it could be very little, depending on how much these subjects have blown, but ultimately that's where ideally that's where it's going to lead. You're going to go back to where monies have been moved, where assets have been moved, and then identify those for recovery.
So could people do this easily for themselves? If you had an internal legal department, is this something they could do easily on their own? What's the value that you really feel that you bring to these kind of situations?
Yeah, I believe our value really is the ability to be efficient with it. On the front end, anyone can sit back and try to dig across various sources of publicly available information. But then it's a matter of beginning to fine tune those searches and fine tune where to expend the most valuable resource, which is time. Time is money. That really is our value there, is just the ability to leverage our experience in different situations to focus efforts where hopefully the biggest bang for the buck, if you will, comes about.
So, Chuck, you go after assets. Now, I presume you mean boats, some nice little super jets. Do you get to keep any of these when you're going after them?
I wish. Maybe in my prior life with the government, we did at times, but unfortunately not for personal use.
Oh, what a shame.
I know.
It's so disappointing. So come on, tell me about the kind of people that come to you and say, go and get me my assets back. Who would that be?
Ultimately, our principal contact will be through the counsel of potentially a private equity group or a group of investors who have been taken advantage of, for lack of a better phrase per se, by an individual or individuals who ultimately took money for a specific purpose and likely did not use it for the particular purpose they should have used it for.
Yeah, so it'd be like my PA going off and using my company credit card to buy a holiday in the Caribbean. That kind of thing.
Probably a little larger, a few more zeros at the end, which would bring in the rest of the councils and courts and whatnot.
So, Chuck, give me an example of a particular case or how a case might work through.
Well, a great example would be, or a situation would be, where a receiver may have obtained a judgment against a defendant. And it's because that defendant had absconded with funds or assets. And that defendant, they may have converted the assets to funds and deposited those funds in unknown accounts, and maybe using those funds from these unknown accounts to currently fund their lifestyle. And so that would be something we've been engaged to do, is to help the receiver and plaintiff, if you will, track down where their monies are located now.
They've basically run off. They've taken 10 million from their employer. They are now spending it somewhere else in the country, or maybe they've gone abroad. You don't know where they are. So you're tracking down not only them, but what they've done with that 10 million.
Ideally, the receiver or plaintiff has received a court judgment against the defendant. And so then the courts can be leveraged and legal process can be leveraged once maybe institutions or other entities have been identified where these funds that were absconded with are maybe deposited.
So that the judgment's already come from the court. So the company that's had the money, the 10 million taken, they've been to the court. The court said You've got the judgment to go after those assets. And that's when they bring you in and you go on a hunting mission like Poirot to track down.
Exactly.
So, I mean, that's incredibly interesting, Chuck. And, it's obviously a very complex area and one that obviously you're very specialist in with your FBI background. But if people wanted to get hold of you to have a chat about it, if it's something they're coming up against at the moment, where would they get hold of you?
They can reach out to my LinkedIn profile or chuck.story@rehmann.com. Those are the easiest ways to go about. Always willing and open to discuss and collaborate on the front end. And quite frankly, determine if it is a true value proposition for the prospect as well as for us. I mean, I'm not going to sell someone down the road for something we can't make progress and provide value in a situation.
Well, thanks very much, Chuck, for your time today. That's been really interesting.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining Chip for this podcast. If you want to get in touch with Chip or any of his guests, please contact him through the Rehmann website, www.rehmann.com, or on LinkedIn. All views expressed in this podcast are individual opinions and do not constitute professional advice. Thank you.